The Audacious Bet, the 1805 Gamble. The story begins not with a bank, but with a punchline. In 1805, 21-year-old Frederic Tudor looked at the frozen ponds of Massachusetts and saw a white gold mine. At the time, ice was a local luxury used only for winter preservation. Tudor's vision was insane. He would harvest this ice and ship it to the sweltering heat of the Caribbean. He was met with universal mockery. The Boston elite called him a madman. Ship captains refused to carry his melting cargo, fearing the water would rot their hulls or sink the vessels. Undeterred, Tudor spent nearly every cent he had to buy his own ship, the Favorite, and loaded it with 130 tons of ice destined for Martinique. He wasn't just selling a product, he was attempting to export a climate that the tropical world didn't even know it needed. As his ship set sail from the Boston harbor, the doubters were vocal in their predictions of failure. It was one thing to harvest ice from the frosty New England winters, but quite another to preserve it long enough to survive a transatlantic journey. Tudor's gamble was bigger than just the ice. It was about changing the way people lived in warmer climates, introducing them to refrigeration, or at least the earliest precursor of it. But the odds were stacked against him. The journey was arduous. The ice, packed into insulated wooden crates, faced a constant battle against the relentless heat. Tudor's ship encountered rough seas, and the ice began to melt faster than anticipated. But his tenacity and a bit of luck paid off. Upon arrival in Martinique, the island's residents were fascinated by the ice. Tudor sold the cargo at a premium to plantation owners who saw its value for preserving food, especially perishables like fish and meat, as well as cooling drinks for the affluent. Tudor didn't stop there. He saw potential in this tropical venture and expanded his operations. Over the next decade, he would push forward, conquering logistical and financial setbacks, facing fierce competition and battling skepticism at every turn. He would eventually ship ice to New York, Charleston, and even as far as Europe, changing global trade and commerce forever. But to understand how Tudor became an icon of American entrepreneurship, it's crucial to see this moment, the 1805 gamble, not just as the beginning of his empire, but as the crystallization of a vision. A vision that wasn't just about ice, but about transforming entire industries and ways of life. Tudor wasn't simply playing a numbers game. He was betting on the future of convenience, preservation, and comfort, ideas that were yet to be born. As the years passed, more and more people came to realize that the madman from Boston had been ahead of his time. The once ridiculed ice trade would evolve into a global industry, and Tudor would be the one who had made it all possible. Yet, even as he basked in success, the audacity of his first move would remain his defining trait, the willingness to risk everything on an idea that no one else believed in. The melting fortune. The first failure. Upon arrival in Martinique, the dream turned into a literal puddle. Tudor had no warehouse to store the ice, and the locals, having never seen a frozen liquid, had no idea how to use it. They stared in confusion as the rocks vanished into water. He lost over $4,000, a fortune in 1806, and returned to Boston a laughingstock. This began a decade of brutal financial oscillation. Between 1809 and 1813, Tudor was hounded by creditors. He spent months in debtor's prison, watching the world move on while he sat in a cramped cell. However, this was his think tank period. In prison, he obsessed over thermodynamics. He filled notebooks with sketches of double-walled insulation using sawdust, hay, and charcoal. He realized his failure wasn't the ice, it was the infrastructure. The addictive strategy. Once released from prison, Tudor transformed from a dreamer into a cold-blooded strategist. He realized that to sell ice, he had to create an addiction. He understood a fundamental rule of commerce. A luxury, once tasted, becomes a necessity. He traveled to bars and hotels throughout the American South, offering ice for free to bartenders for a limited time, a loss leader strategy that predated modern marketing by a century. He didn't just deliver the product, he delivered the experience. He taught them how to make chilled cocktails like the mint julep, turning a gritty room-temperature spirit into a refined, frost-covered delight. He courted the medical community, showing doctors how ice could break a fever or numb a wound, pivoting his product from a party trick to a life-saving tool. Once the wealthy elite tasted a cold drink in 90-degree heat, they couldn't go back to lukewarm water. The sensory contrast was too profound to ignore. Tudor had successfully hooked his market. However, the true genius lay in his logistics. He built a chain of massive, specialized ice houses from Charleston to New Orleans, using the insulation techniques he perfected in prison. These structures were architectural marvels of the era, vast windowless monoliths with double brick walls and tons of packed sawdust acting as a thermal barrier. By 1820, the man who was once a joke was now the sole proprietor of a growing cold empire. He had moved beyond simple trade and into the realm of habit building. He didn't just sell frozen water, he sold the sensation of relief. His ledger, once filled with the red ink of debt, was now a map of every major port in the Western Hemisphere, all dependent on a Boston man's ability to keep the winter alive in the height of summer. The 16,000-mile miracle. In 1833, Tudor decided to silence his critics forever by attempting the impossible, shipping ice to Calcutta, India. It was a 4-month voyage across the equator, covering 16,000 miles, a journey many seasoned captains called a suicide mission for cargo. The logistical nightmare wasn't just the distance, it was the double crossing of the tropics, where the ship's hull would be baked by the relentless sun of the Indian Ocean. He packed the ship Tuscany with 180 tons of ice, insulating it with massive amounts of New England sawdust, a waste product he got for nearly nothing from lumber mills. This was his masterstroke, turning the refuse of one industry into the lifeblood of another. He treated the ship like a giant floating thermos, sealing every crack with airtight precision. When the ship docked in India, the local British residents and Indian merchants were stunned. They gathered at the docks expecting to see a damp hull and empty crates. Instead, when the hatches were pried open, a cloud of cold mist erupted into the sweltering Calcutta heat. Despite the grueling 4-month journey, over 100 tons of ice remained solid, gleaming like diamonds in the tropical sun. This venture was a gold mine. The ice sold for astronomical prices, often fetching a premium from British officials desperate for a taste of home. But more than the money, the Calcutta voyage secured his legacy. It proved that waste, sawdust, and worthless weather, frozen ponds, could be combined into a high-value export. He had turned a New England winter into a global commodity, proving that with enough insulation and sheer will, geography was no longer a barrier to profit. The Ice King no longer just ruled Boston, he had conquered the equator. The King's Monopoly, the Dark Legacy. By the 1850s, Frederic Tudor was one of the richest men in America. But his success came with a sharp edge. He was a ruthless monopolist who crushed any competitor who tried to enter the ice trade. He maintained a vertical stranglehold on the industry, owning the ponds where the ice was harvested, the patents on the plows that cut it, the ships that carried it, and the warehouses that stored it. Anyone attempting to undercut his prices found themselves facing a predatory price war they couldn't win. His most controversial war was against John Gorey, a Florida physician who had invented a primitive mechanical refrigeration machine to cool the rooms of yellow fever patients. Fearing that artificial ice would destroy his harvest business, Tudor used his massive wealth to launch a vicious smear campaign. He leveraged his influence in the press to mock Gorey as a crank who thought he could outdo nature. Tudor framed the conflict as a moral one.
He told the public that God's ice, the natural product harvested from the pure ponds of New England, was wholesome and divine, while man-made ice was diseased, chemically tainted, and unnatural. He even lobbied for taxes and regulations on mechanical cooling devices. He successfully delayed the widespread adoption of air conditioning and commercial refrigeration for decades, purely to protect his bottom line. When he died in 1864, the Ice King left behind a transformed world. He had taught the globe how to crave the cold, yet he had spent his final years actively stifling the technology that would eventually make his empire obsolete. He died as a titan of industry, but his legacy was a double-edged sword. He was the man who gave the world the cool luxury of ice, while simultaneously sabotaging the very science that would democratize it.